Welcome back, guys. First off, it is getting to be that time of the year again. The undisputable best holiday out of the entire year. Just a couple months away here. But I hope all is going well for you guys. Let's get into the Q&A this week. So the first question basically asks when to add sets. And this is like the question, I think, as we know volume is a pretty important deal when it comes to hypertrophy, with the caveat that volume is coming from, and when I say volume, I'm talking about how many sets you're doing per week per muscle. And the caveat there is that each set is challenging. Each set is within a few reps from failure. We know that is probably one of the most important things when it comes to our training to make sure that we have about right. So when do you add sets? When do you do more volume? And I think that my preferred method of going about this is kind of using different proxies. And if you're familiar with Mike Israetel and kind of his suggestions around this is kind of the side of things to where I lie as well. And what I like to look at is, hey, it might be a good idea to add some sets if you finish your workout or the following day after your training. You don't feel any like sort of fatigue, any sort of muscle soreness. Like there's no sensation that you actually like disrupted that muscle group. If you didn't feel any of that, or you finished the session and it felt subjectively easy, or you didn't get great muscle pumps, and all of this is within the caveat that you're using good technique and you're using really good form in the gym. I think that something that I didn't pay enough attention to when I was kind of starting out was the importance of each and every rep really focusing on what you're doing, training with intent, and making sure you're training the target muscle group. I kind of had the idea in my head that if I just ate in a surplus and I did a few sets per week, that I would grow. And when you're just starting out, like there's some truth to that, but you're going to get to a point to where you really have to train with intent and make sure that you are training your target muscle group. So if you make sure of that, but you finish a session and the following day you have really no signs of muscle overload, of that fatigue, of maybe a little soreness, or you didn't get great pumps, even with great technique, and it felt pretty easy, that's when I start to look at, hey, let's maybe up this volume a little bit here. And I would probably hit how much volume? Well, it depends on like how the workout felt and stuff like that. In general, I tend to approach my accumulations of adding anywhere between 1 to 3 sets per week for muscle groups that we're kind of focusing on more and that we're prioritizing and stuff like that. So that's kind of where I look at to when to add sets there. It's when those proxies of, okay, did I feel any sort of overload here, or are there any signs of overload? How were my sessions? How did it subjectively feel? Making sure my technique is locked in. If I don't notice any of those, then I tend to add sets. And even in the context of if I did get some signs of overload, but I didn't have any overlapping soreness, my performance is still good, everything was like in check, there's no signs of doing too much, then I still might add maybe on the lower end of 1 to 2 sets for that muscle the following week if I'm focusing on that muscle, as we're kind of taking advantage of that repeated bout effect. And I think that the following week, adding 1 to 2 sets is probably going to result in a pretty similar stimulus as the prior week. And if that was about right, I think that would be a good approach there. All right. So hopefully that helps you out there. Question number 2, what is my favorite progression scheme? So I think that for hypertrophy, this really doesn't have to be anything that is all that fancy. Like, I think that double progression, and if you don't know what these are, there's a ton of videos about them. Like JPS Health and Fitness, I think especially has some good videos, and their Instagram account has some stuff about this. But there's like double progression, triple progression, different sort of progression schemes for when to add weight. That's kind of what I'm saying when progression scheme. When should we add weight? And I think that for bodybuilding, I think that the most important thing is those challenging sets with a really good technique and hitting a reps in reserve. So I focus on hitting a target reps in reserve and letting the weight progression take care of itself. If you don't sandbag your reps in reserve and you make sure you're hitting your reps in reserve, then over time, if you're getting stronger, you'll be automatically adding weight so you keep hitting your reps in reserve target. So I don't really get, fancy with the progression scheme. I think that you absolutely can, and that can work well, but my preferred method is just hitting the reps in reserve and then over time letting your reps in reserve dictate when you add weight. If it was too easy and to hit your reps in reserve, you go above your target rep range, that's when you add weight. All right. Question number 3, regarding failure, isn't the fact that at some point you can't progressively overload provide an argument against it? So what I believe that this question here is referring to is that if you only try to progressively train harder and harder, and know what I think is terrible advice, train harder than you did last time. I think that is like the worst advice I've ever heard in my entire life. Okay, it's not that bad, but I really don't like that. And why don't I like that? We can only go so far with that. Like, you only have 100% effort. There's nothing above that. Like, if you train with a mentality of it's got to be harder than last time, then I think that that's when you run into issues of throwing out your technique and just doing jackass stuff in the gym because you think that it has to be quote unquote harder than last time. And I think that when most people say that, they mean that over time, the absolute stimulus that you provide probably needs to go up. I think that's kind of what people mean when they say you need to train harder than last time. And I would agree with that. I think that over time, the absolute stimulus probably has to go up to continue to elicit adaptations. But that doesn't mean that each set just feels a ton harder. We can only push that so far. And I think that that's kind of what this question is getting at. It's like, you can't keep training closer to failure forever. At some point, you hit failure. And I definitely agree with that. I think that if the only card that you can play is training closer to failure, then at some point you're gonna run out of things that you can do to keep providing that stimulus. And I think that looking towards or using a combination of things like across the mesocycle, training a little bit closer to failure, yeah, I think that makes sense. It helps manage fatigue throughout the entire course of your mesocycle. Also, increasing sets here and there when reasonable, like I talked about earlier about when to add sets. I think that also seems reasonable. Adding reps here and there, that's also a good way to have this increase in the absolute kind of stimulus over time. And of course, also adding weight to the bar over time, probably a pretty good idea. So I think that it's generally not good advice to just say train harder than last time. I think that kind of misses the boat on what we're really trying to get at, and it can result in people who, like, I think that most people mean well when they say that, and it's probably like, hey, we have to, over time, the overall stimulus probably has to go up a little bit. But we can't just, I know that in the past, that's what I would try to do is each and every workout, I would try to do a little bit more reps here and there. And I still think that that's like a general, like good default approach to try to do a little bit more than last time. But if you really get into that mentality, then I really think that that's when you start focusing more so on just moving the weight up and doing things in the gym that aren't as conducive to using good technique, really training with intent, like I talked about, and that sort of thing. So I absolutely think that the TLDR to this question is absolutely, I think that there is a limit on how hard you can train. I think that I would say that most people probably sandbag that a little bit to where they maybe aren't pushing themselves as hard as they think. And I think that this is true for a lot of people. Like, if even myself, like if I go from training in the morning all by myself in an empty gym compared to training with, I think back to when I played football and I would train with the rest of my team and it would be me and 3 other strong dudes lifting together. Like, there's a different intensity that comes with that. So I think that we definitely may have a tendency, at least some people, to sandbag things here and there. But I do think that the fact that we can only play that card so much means that it makes sense to look at other forms of progressing things across the career. So hopefully that answers your question there, man. The next question, I keep going off my diet. What should I do about it? This is the question. I think that if I had the answer to this one, then, I could solve a lot of issues that we have kind of worldwide right now, So first off, I don't love the phrasing off my diet. That kind of makes it sound like there might be some of that on again and off again mentality of, when I finish my diet, then I just go back to my old eating behaviors, which probably isn't what you want if you want to maintain that fat loss over time. So let me go over some strategies that I've used with clients that tend to help when we go off the rails a little bit, which most clients, something like this does happen. So one thing is when you start to feel the kind of urge to, and there's so much to this question, like psychology, human behavior, and so many different things that go into this. But a couple things that have helped when you start considering going off your diet, just try to pause. Try to stop and think about your goals and whether the trade-off right now in the moment is worth it to you. Is going over my calories today by 500. Is that worth extending my diet by another couple of days? Stop and ask yourself that question. And if it's worth it to you, then you accepted that trade-off and you're an adult, you can make decisions based on thinking about those trade-offs. But I think that most people, when they stop and pause and think, man, is this extra cookie or this extra muffin, is this worth having to extend my diet by another couple of days just for this 30 seconds of mouth pleasure? I think a lot of people end up stopping, pausing themselves, and saying, hey, I'm going to be okay here if I don't have that right now. So I think that that's helpful. Other things that you can do, and the first one that comes to mind is a little bit more kind of hacky. At least it feels a little bit more hacky, but that's kind of the out of sight, out of mind thing, to where making foods that tend to trigger you to overeat, making those harder to get to. So not keeping them in the house if you can. I know that a lot of people live with other people that don't necessarily do this whole bodybuilding thing a whole lot, so that could be tricky. So if you can, like, move that stuff around even to the back of the fridge, stuff like that, making it more challenging to get to, that can be potentially helpful. Also, if there's other things that you can kind of distract yourself with when you start thinking about food or stuff like that, that can be helpful. So trying to stay busy, like, okay, I'm starting to get a little bit hungry here. What else could I do to keep my mind busy so I'm not kind of thinking about it? That can be helpful. Also, I think that one of the biggest reasons that people tend to go off their diets a little bit is because of social pressures of like eating with friends and family. And this kind of goes back to the trade-offs thing, to where stop, pause. Is the trade-off worth it to you? For a lot of people, if it means that they're going to enjoy their night or their day with their friends a lot more, if they eat what they're eating and stuff like that, and they're okay with extending their diet by an extra day, then, like I said before, you're an adult, and that's a decision that is definitely reasonable. But one thing that can help is, if these situations come up a lot, is just trying to, and I know this is hard and it's a lot easier said than done. Even I myself have a hard time with this, because I tend to keep things to myself a little bit more, but opening up to like your friends and family and being like, hey, right now for this next couple months, I'm going to be kind of going through diet, and I'm going to be maybe not participating as much as I usually would. So, this goal is really important to me, and I'm going to still like hang out with you guys. I just might not participate in this stuff as much. Like, most people are going to be respectful of that. If they're not, then get new friends. I don't know. But most people are going to be cool about that, and opening up that conversation can help relieve some of that social pressure to kind of make sure you're participating. But that doesn't mean you can never participate in that stuff. If you are dieting, just accept the trade-offs, think about them. And I think those are some things that can help out with that. That's definitely not everything. Everybody's a little bit different for figuring out what works there, but I do hope that helps. So I appreciate you guys tuning in, and I will see you in that next one.